If you watch the Academy Awards this year, you're undoubtedly familiar with the film Killers of the Flower Moon, which depicts the very real event known as the Reign of Terror that took place on the Osage Reservation in the early 20th century. It's not often on this show that we get to speak to someone with a personal connection to an historical event. But today is different. Today, we're talking about the history of the Osage people before and after the Reign of Terror, how A Dinner with Scorsese changed the course of the film, and what it was like to see the movie from an Osage perspective, with former chief of the Osage Nation, Jim Gray. This is Too Complicated for History.
Hey, everybody. Today we have with us James Roan Gray, we'll call him Jim, former chief of the Osage Nation from 2002 to 2010. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Jim.
Thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Isaac and I have both seen and loved the movie Killers of the Flower Moon, but we also want to talk about the history that wasn't in the book. But
Okay.
where I wanted to start is after I saw the movie and I wanted to know more about it, specifically the background of it from someone from the Osage Nation, you seem to pop up everywhere. And it's almost like you're the unofficial, if not official, spokesperson for this movie. So can you give us a little bit of background on yourself and sort of how you got here today?
Yeah. One, I'm as a former chief of the tribe, and there's a few of us still around, that we tend to, even though we no longer serve in that capacity, we never stop caring,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the reasons that I cared about this. I have a background in media. I used to be PR person. I was a journalist before, and I did some marketing and advertising, and so that's my professional background.
Nice.
And I know the power of image, and I know the power of what it can do. And so you take those two things and you combine it with the fact that I'm a descendant of one of the principal individuals in this story who was murdered and left my mom basically having to be an orphan. And she was later adopted by an Osage family who raised her as her own daughter. So this story is more than just a little bit of history. It's a family story as much as it is our tribe's story. So if I get asked to speak about it, that's probably why. I've been doing a lot of that.
Well, and we definitely appreciate it. I think it brings a whole nother level of sort of emotion to those of us who aren't connected to it, to be able to talk to someone who actually
Right.
has that connection.
I understand. There's this story has largely been forgotten in the mainstream, but when it happened, it was in every newspaper in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And that part, I think a lot of people don't realize that in our society, we tend to have short memories, but in the 1920s, this and the Scopes trial were kind of like the biggest things in the news. And one of the things that made the Osage story so interesting was because of the amount of wealth that the Osages had collected from the royalties of drilling on our land. It became a bit of a curiosity for the media at the time to sensationalize the spending and the lifestyle of the Osages who suddenly fell into this money, and it captivated the imagination of some people, but it also brought some of the worst elements in society into our community to prey on the opportunity to get a piece of the action, so to speak.
Right.
we had suffered an enormous amount of loss in the previous century because of the removals from our traditional lands
Right.
and being pushed by westward expansion into smaller pieces of land, to the point where we ended up here in Indian Territory, which later became Oklahoma in the 1870s. And but by the time we entered our first treaty in the United States in 1808 until the last one in 1868, we had lost basically 90% of our tribal population
Wow.
through exposure, disease, and probably despair. And because of that, we lost a lot of our traditions.
Right.
A lot of the medicines that grew abundantly in Missouri and the Ozarks did not grow in the plains of Oklahoma.
Right.
So we couldn't even take care of our sick or elderly in the same way that we had taken care of our communities for centuries. And so this was as big a shift of our perspective as you can imagine, that in order for us to survive, we realized that we were going to have to learn new ways
Right.
and to adapt. And we started doing that. We brought in our cousin tribes, the Ponca tribe and the Kaw tribe, which we share a linguistic similarity. At one time, centuries ago, according to our oral stories, we were all one tribe, but we broke up into 5 different tribes. And so we had a relationship with the Poncas and the Kaws that when we came down here, they brought us these songs. They called it the Lonchka. And these songs is a dance that kept the tribe culturally together at a time of great change. And so we preserve these dances, and we still practice them even to this day. In fact, they're bigger now than they have ever been. So the cultural aspect of the tribe was important to us, holding ourselves together, retaining the clan systems and the traditional forms of government, but we had to adapt that traditional government into a constitutional one that we later accepted in 1881. We started rebuilding our communities. And but unfortunately, westward expansion wasn't satisfied with rounding us up and putting us in Indian Territory because they wanted the land. So Oklahoma was going to be admitted as a state. And in order to do that, they had to break up the communal land holdings of all the tribes that were based here. And so that resulted in a policy called allotment. This allotment is that they would award every member of the tribe 160 acres. And anything that was not allotted was opened up for white settlement. With the exception of the Osage, that's how all the lands in Indian Territory got broken up, and the land rush. And then you ever see those old pictures of the land run coming across Kansas into India?
Yeah.
That's what it was. And in the Osage's case, we bought our reservation because we sold our lands in Kansas. So we used the money from the proceeds of that sale to buy our land from the Cherokees, who were already there.
Okay.
Gotcha.
And so because we bought it, it wasn't easy to break up our lands without our consent.
Sure.
So we couldn't stop it altogether, but we could negotiate a separate kind of relationship. And that relationship was securing for ourselves the mineral estate, the subsurface rights would still remain collectively owned by the tribe.
Right.
And the surface lands would be allotted. And that unique feature came in greater focus when oil was discovered.
Right.
Yet at the time, they already discovered oil, but they didn't know they were going to hit this huge field called the Burbank Field until later. But that's when we became millionaires overnight, when that money started pouring in.
Right.
And so at one point, the Osage Nation was 10% of the nation's oil supply. At the time of the Industrial Revolution, machinery and factories and mass producing all kinds of stuff. And of course, World War One, they had to power the war effort. And so oil was a prized commodity at the time, and it still is, but then it was like gold, and
that was your get rich quick.
That was
right?
how that's how all that happened.
Right.
And so, and that basically was the ingredients that laid the foundation for us to come into all this money. But once that money started coming in, the media descended to start telling these stories, in a way misleading the public about our spending.
Right.
Our spending is pretty much in line with anybody else who was in the same income bracket. It wasn't unusual that we had nice cars. It wasn't unusual we had nice homes. It wasn't unusual that we wore nice clothes. And but they didn't feel like that was the image they wanted the public to see. So the federal government, in its infinite wisdom, said these poor Indians can't take care of their money, so we're going to appoint a white guardian to oversee all their financial affairs. And this guardianship policy of the day basically put the fox in charge of the hen house, so to speak, because this guardian was able to secure himself an administrative fee over every transaction that took place, whether it was groceries or whether it was a vehicle or farm equipment or whatever their needs were. They would assess a fee for managing that money.
Right.
They would also cut deals with local stores and a relationship. So it wasn't just how much they were spending, but where they spent it.
Sure.
And these relationships, oftentimes, the guardian had a brother who owned the grocery store or the dry goods store, appliances or whatever, and there's no way you could police that from Washington, D.C. So this practice went on, and eventually it caught the attention of the feds, and eventually they ended up having to amend the practice of the guardianship program years later, but not before these guardians had absconded with over $6 million in 1 year.
And the
$20.
The beginning of the guardianships was done just from a public relations perspective. It was like, hey, they must not be.
They were reading these fantastic stories in the local news of their spending, and they all got together in Washington, D.C., and something has to be done about this, and not once were they even curious about whether or not any of these stories were true.
Sure.
They just acted on the image that was being created.
Sorry to interrupt, but if you're watching this on YouTube, you may notice that you can see my face right now. We're excited to announce that we are releasing full episodes with video on our YouTube channel, Primary Source Media. So make sure you subscribe there if you'd like to see how confused I look most of the time, or see the log cabin that Lynn lives in. Anyway, back to the convo. Now, there's a term used in the movie when they're describing the allotments, restricted versus unrestricted. Do you think you could describe exactly what that meant and to people who were
it's a question of competency. These were the 1920s. American Indians weren't even considered citizens of the United States until 1924. And so we were essentially wards of the government. And we had to have these kind of individuals placed in charge of our affairs, these guardians. The way one would be released from their guardianship and being in that situation is to get your competency papers approved by a federal official, usually at the Department of Interior, who had responsibility for, dealing with, the tribes and individual tribal members. It's not like they did. I don't know where we fit into the grand scheme of things in terms of our relationship with the United States. But back in those days, they put us in the U.S. Department of Interior with the rocks and the animals and the birds and the fish, wildlife. I guess we didn't fit in any other category in the federal system at the time, so that's where they stuck us, and that's where we're at today, even now. So my guess is that they created this, but they also did it based on blood quantum. So if you were half blood or more Osage with a head right, you didn't get to negotiate that. You were automatically assigned a guardian for the rest of your life. And if you were less than that, like a fourth Indian, you could apply and sometimes receive the lifting of those restricted status. And so it was very racist in its nature and how it was applied. And but unfortunately, this gave rise to all kinds of white-collar crimes being committed against Indians who fell under the guardianship of these individuals. And in the book, Killers of the Flower Moon, David Grann does cover a portion of that issue. And that in some cases, the guardians were good. They took care. They took their responsibility seriously. In many cases, they were not good.
Sure.
And one of the ways in which they were able to do it is to get them in a situation where they had children. And the minor children would require a guardian.
Right.
And they would kill the parents would somehow have a car wreck or drink
some
poison
mysterious
whiskey, or some suicide,
death,
suspicious circumstances,
and they would pass away, and then their children would inherit their share of the interest in the mineral estate. And so the guardian would have a kind of a cradle to grave kind of relationship with these individuals, literally living.
Was that control of the mineral estate? Well, thank you for actually like running up a lot of like the history of the tribe prior to that and explaining how we got to that situation that's depicted in the movie. And is that control of the mineral estate? Is that a unique thing for the Osage? Was that because the land was purchased from the Cherokee? Did they have the same kind of rights over their?
I don't know of any other tribe that has a mineral estate that is separate from their. I mean, we were set up in a very unique way because we had bought our reservation. It gave us some leverage to negotiate something that was unique. We did. But in practice, though, what the federal government did was that they abolished the 1881 Constitution that we had in 1901. And so we didn't even have a tribal government per se until 1906 when they did this Allotment Act. Section 9 of the Allotment Act was the creation of a new tribal council. And in that process, they created, by federal law, who was an Osage, what powers the Osage Tribal Council had, who could run, who could vote, the length of their terms. All of that was imposed on us at the time. And, so we had to accept an awful lot of, good and bad and ugly, considering the policies of the day, because it wasn't enough to break up our tribal governments. It wasn't enough to break up our lands. They had to do this extra thing, which was take our kids out of our homes and send them to these boarding schools all around the country, sometimes for years, without ever communicating back with their families. And in those school systems, they would beat them if they spoke their language. They would beat them if they didn't follow instructions. They were supposed to learn a trade. Some cases they did. In some cases, they were beaten so severely they committed suicide. They ran away, never came home. It was a scandal. And in recent years, the U.S. Department of Interior is led by the first Native American. Her name is Deb Holland. And she has initiated a kind of a listening session. And she's held these all over the United States and Indian country where these descendants or survivors of the boarding school experience were telling their stories of what happened to them in these situations. And so even though we're talking about something that happened 100 years ago, this practice went on clear up until the early 70s of taking kids out of these homes and putting them through this.
And it's wild because I'm having flashbacks from studying the 18th century with,
Yeah.
with slavery and with women and not being citizens and, being deemed not intelligent enough to take care of yourself and you need
Right.
someone to help you. And
This may
it
come as a
seems
big
like,
surprise, but Native Americans were doing fine on their own for thousands of years.
right.
Right.
Absolutely.
This sometimes we forget that part. I don't know.
Right. I'm curious to ask about the allotments and how within the tribe they were viewed. Since this was imposed on you from outside forces, this 160 acres, you
Right.
said,
Right.
did the tribe itself view it as like, okay, now this is my spot, like this is my land? The reason why I'm asking is because at the very beginning of the movie, the character that they're portraying is your great grandfather,
Right.
and he's driving Leonardo DiCaprio's
Right.
character to his uncle's house, and it's one of the
Mhm.
first scenes in the movie. And Leo asks Henry, or Ernest asks Henry, whose land is this? And he says, my land. And he says, and that line struck me because I wasn't sure whether he was actually talking about his land or whether it's my land and that this is the tribal land and this is all
Right.
like our land.
I think it's the latter, just trying to read between the lines a little bit.
Yeah.
It doesn't try to answer that question, that
Sure.
conversation. I'm thinking that we walked here from Kansas in 1872, so this would have been about 10 years before Henry was born.
Mhm.
So he got to experience part of his life of what Osage life was like before allotment.
Sure.
Right.
So I think my guess is that he meant the tribes.
Meant the tribe's land. That's sort of what was my read too.
Yeah.
Right.
Plus, we own the subsurface collectively as well.
Right.
So
Right. Yeah.
I think that just reinforces the answer.
I'm not sure how much you know about your great grandfather, but I'd love to learn more about him, not just as, the victim of this, horrible reign of terror, but sort of who he was as a person and, how you feel connected to him and maybe what his legacy is. It's more of who he was as an individual.
I wish there was more I could tell you. Unfortunately, there's not a lot written about his life. And because he died 2 years before my mom was born,
Right.
we don't have any personal references to any stories, family stories or anything like that, other than what the government investigations had in their files. And then that was unfortunate because he was viewed in history largely as a drunk Indian, the old trope, right?
Right.
And but he did have a wife, he had children, and Grace was his daughter, and that was my grandma. And a few years after Henry Roan was murdered, she died in a car wreck. And my mom's younger brother, my uncle, who was with her in that car, died as well. So he would have been an infant. His name was James, and so
Okay.
my name is James Roan Gray, named after my uncle and my great grandfather. The thing is that justice was not something that came to Osages until a lot of pain had occurred. And even when justice did come, it didn't. They got their headline, they got their easy win, and they left.
Right.
It left the Osages vulnerable because they were successful in going to D.C. to petition the government to investigate these murders, because it wasn't just my grandfather or my great-grandfather. There were scores and scores of Osages being murdered. None of them were being investigated. The local police didn't even look into it. They were either indifferent or complicit. We don't know. But the end result is that the feds had to come in, but not until the tribal council put $20,000 on the table and said, will you investigate these murders?
Wow.
And, so when they finished their investigation, they got their convictions and they sent these guys to jail, they left. But the killing kept going on. There was still that crime that was taking place, that exploitation, the abuse, the marrying into the tribe. And all of a sudden, all these wards of these guardians were dying in mysterious circumstances. And so that's the legacy that Henry Roan was part of. He's the one, probably the people that are familiar with the story, he's probably one of the most well-known ones, as well as Molly Kyle and her sisters. And that's largely because of the FBI. But a lot of people just don't talk about it in our tribe.
Right.
It's a painful period of time in our tribe. And I can understand that, because who wants to, open those old wounds, right? And but as somebody who didn't have the luxury of being anonymous about it, I chose to just, I might as well just accept that this is going to be something I'm going to have to talk about for the rest of my life. It's just people are going to want to know. And there's a whole file of my great-grandfather's life and death in the FBI files. What they didn't do in the book, and I wish they had, but they didn't do it in the book or the movie, was to talk about his experience in the boarding school. Because they didn't send him to one down the street. They sent him all the way to Carlisle, Pennsylvania by railroad.
Oh, geez.
And he was there for 7 years. And the only thing I found in doing research on his life was a survey he filled out. And this survey was a very short 5-question survey about, what are you doing today? What are you doing with your life? This sort of thing. The school was doing some follow-up, I guess. And you could tell by his answers, he wasn't interested in communicating at all.
Right.
He just wanted to be left alone. And
makes sense.
Bothering me.
Understandable, yes.
And of course, there's a picture of him while he's in school. I can email it to you. You can see it. It's a picture of him. His hair has been cut. He's wearing a suit.
Oh, geez.
And it was part of the before and after photos that the school took to promote the school's success.
We would love to see that and even share it with our listeners and our viewers, if you don't mind.
I could email it to you.
That would be great.
Yeah, it's interesting. The boarding schools, contextually, the boarding schools, just for people who aren't really aware of the overall history, it was a kind of way of cultural genocide without violence. Right. It was systematically put in place
assimilation
all over North America.
The guy who ran the Carlisle boarding school, his name is Colonel Pratt at the time. And he said the policy of this school is to kill the Indian and save the man.
Right.
We didn't know it meant literally kill the Indians to save the men. But this is, here's the picture right there.
Oh, wow.
Oh, that's fantastic.
That's him there. That's fascinating. So that was the after photo. Like look how.
After they got him, assimilated, properly
right.
So not only were they breaking their spirits by denying their cultural expressions and observances and their language, they would change their appearance. And when I look at pictures of him after he's been through that and he came home, unfortunately, he was robbed of an Osage upbringing, so that had to have contributed to some of his choices that he made, not knowing where he fits in.
Sure.
And then doesn't surprise me that he found himself in, a really toxic relationship with William Hale, who orchestrated all these killings. And so but these pictures of him that I wanted to bring to your attention is that as a man, he grew his hair out. He had braids, dressed in the style of an Osage man of that era. And I was telling my sons about it. I was like, I'm kind of glad that I have this picture, but I also have this other picture. And in this picture, they did not succeed in changing him.
Right.
And I thought that was something that was, My wife's coming through for me here.
Oh, she's
Oh,
fantastic.
this is great.
So this is him, as you can tell.
Oh, that's phenomenal.
Braids are still there. He's wearing the scarf, handkerchief.
Yeah.
He looks like a men's suit there of the 1920s modern man, but clearly he's not checking his Osageness at the door. You know?
Right.
Yes.
And I think that is what I believe is the legacy of that era of him. His story, I think, is one that I've told my sons. I said, you know, when they tried to prosecute William Hale for ordering the killing of my great grandfather Henry Roan,
Mm-hmm.
William Hale was a wealthy man, you know, so he had the resources to hire the best attorneys in the country to defend him. And even though the movie just touches on the trial of Henry Roan, in the real life, if you read the book, it took several trials to get him.
Yeah, there were several hung juries. It took over and over again. Yeah.
There was questions of jurisdiction. They said this is Indian land, so the feds don't have any jurisdiction here. And then, of course, because of the Major Crimes Act, the feds did have jurisdiction. It was just a question of whether they had jurisdiction on allotment land. And the reason Henry Roan was able to be prosecuted by the feds is that his murder took place on a homestead allotment out in the country. And that's why the blowing up of the houses in town in Fairfax were not investigated or prosecuted by the feds, other than the killing of the Indian on the Indian. You know, I mean, the women that were there. But the housekeeper, you know, that had to be tried in state, you know. And so there's a lot of legal issues here that's apart from the personal tragedy. And one of the things that Henry Roan's legacy is that it had to go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court to determine if the feds had jurisdiction to prosecute a major crime against an Indian on Indian land that was allotted.
Right.
This particular question laid the foundation of federal Indian law as we understand it today. The Ramsey case is what they call it. And Ramsey was the guy who was the trigger man that did the killing that was ordered by Hale of my great grandfather. So, yeah, that's a lot to take in if you were born into this experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Go ahead, Lynn.
We both have questions. So I read somewhere that initially this movie was going to focus on the FBI and sort of the beginnings of the FBI, but thankfully the director, Martin Scorsese, and other people working on the film were willing to meet with some Osage members.
That's correct.
And sort of rework the film so that while it's not written by the Osage, it's much more from your point of view. It's not sort of focused on a whole nother aspect that sort of makes you a side story.
I read somewhere in the profile of the actress Lily Gladstone's portrayal of Molly Burkhart in this film that in the original script she's only in 3 scenes.
Oh my gosh!
Oh, you're kidding!
Imagine what we would have lost out.
I mean, so yeah, it was totally from the FBI's point of view. Leonardo DiCaprio was originally called in to play the FBI agent who does these investigations.
Jesse Plemons' character. Yeah.
And so that had already been in place before descendants of the people who were murdered in this film wrote a letter to Scorsese asking for a meeting. All we heard was just chatter. We did not know whether or not this movie was going to be even remotely respectful of our point of view.
Right.
And we didn't know what their intentions were. All we know is that Scorsese is a legend in the film industry in capturing violence. You know,
Mhm.
it's a big part of his films, his history. So we feared the worst, to be
Right.
honest. And a lot of us got together in community building. We talked about, have they spoken to you? Have they reached out to you? No, they haven't talked to me. And it was like, well, maybe we should write to him and invite him to come to our community. Fix a traditional meal. We'll treat him with respect and ask that he treat us and our ancestors with respect. So that was the intention. And not knowing whether he would have done it or not, we wrote the letter and we sent it to his representatives.
Mhm.
It didn't find its way in front of him. And he did call back and respond and say, let's look at a date and let's do this. And so we got a date on our calendar that worked for him, and everyone came. There was about 150 Osages in the room.
Oh, wow.
Building. And he showed up. He had an entourage, as you could imagine. It wasn't him. He brought all the people who's worked on his films and going back 20, 25 years.
Whoa.
Editors, cinematographers, costume design people who had worked on all his films going back to the 90s were there. And
Wow.
and so there was about 15, 16 of them showed up and went through, and they shook everyone's hand in the room. We had big receiving lines. And after that, we all sat down and ate a traditional Osage meal. And my friend Wilson Pipestail, who was one of he was kind of the MC of that evening.
Okay.
And he was sitting over there and he was watching Scorsese eat traditional meat gravy. It was like a soup. He tasted it, took a little small spoonful of it. And all of a sudden his eyes got big and he just started digging.
It was tasty.
Yeah. We wanted to do it right. We wanted to do it respectfully. And we wanted to put out our best, representation of our cultural, our food,
Sure.
And after that, Wilson got up, and his name's Wilson Pipestem. He's a lawyer. He's Osage and Oto. And he started the conversation by reminding everybody why we're all here and all this stuff, and thanked Mr. Scorsese and his team for coming and accepting our invitation. And shortly after that, he started handing the mic out to certain ones in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And each one of them got up and said something. Some of them were on point. We need to remember that Osage women are, the glue that holds the family and the communities together. They observe not just the traditional raising of the children responsibilities, but they also keep our traditions. They make clothes, they make the food, they teach the language. They are the ones who are asked to sing around the drum. They cook the meals. They are the glue. And
Right.
it's so tempting to look at a story like this and think Molly is just a damsel in distress, being exploited like this. She was far from.
Right.
He was, so that kind of,
Sure.
things were being said. When I had a chance to speak, I said something about the Hollywood's history of just missing the Native point of view.
Yep.
And a lot of the biggest movies that have Native content that by the industry definitions that made money, that awards, that sort of thing,
right,
critical success, all this sort of thing. There's just a few of them that have done all that. And Dances with Wolves is one.
Yep.
Black Deacons, Little Big Man. These all have these same elements in it. One, these are stories written by a white man about Indians.
Right.
Second, it required a white savior character to save the Indian.
Yep.
And third, it's probably, and they're all fiction.
Right.
Right.
And
this is a little bit different. This
doesn't fit any of that. You don't have to make that film.
Right.
Let us help you because the history is accurately written and documented in the book that
Mhm.
David Grann wrote. What is not in the book is the cultural ways of the Osage people, how they dealt with
Right.
adversity, how they dealt with each other, how they handled these observances of life and death and birth and naming and all these things that make up our daily life that is unique to us. That's not in the book, but that knowledge is in this room,
Right.
and nobody in here wants you to fail,
Exactly. You're all trying to help because you
Yeah.
want this to be a successful project.
But we can't go unless we're invited, right?
Right. And the
Exactly.
film is definitely better for it. Thinking about what you
I
said
think
about the
so, but
comment
I'm
about
biased.
women.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So I'm a fan of Scorsese's films and
Yeah.
generally have a lot of historical interest in Native history and sort of like the like interweaving of Native history into American history. But
Right.
thinking just the comment that you just mentioned, I can see how a filmmaker then made that happen, or I can see the
Yeah.
influence there when you're talking about women being sort of the glue that holds the society together.
Right.
I just rewatched the movie yesterday and thinking through how sort of they see all the women that are depicted with one exception, and I think it exemplifies this, feel very like they're rocks. They are grounded, even the way that they move and the way that they walk, except
There
for
was
Anna
certain
when she's kind of going off the
confidence.
rails. Yeah.
Yeah.
They except for Anna when she's going off the rails, like they have this
Yeah.
quiet confidence, and so like they are right exactly where they should be at all times.
I'm sitting I got a private screening of the film before it was
Sure.
premiered at Cannes. And I can tell you, I'm sitting there with my brothers and sisters, and we're all watching, in this small theater that was set up for us.
Yeah.
And other descendants. And I'm elbowing my sister and my brother. Even though it was kind of like a blur, I was so excited to see it because my imagination was going wild about what actually made it on the screen,
Right.
After we got done, I was talking to my brothers and sisters. I was like, what was so unique about the way he did the sisters is that I know Osage women, and there's a little, even the ones that are my contemporaries, I could see elements of their personality reflected in these characters. That
cool.
is truly an Osage point of view, and there are different ways in which they find humor, how they show love, how they show anger,
right,
frustration, and how they lash out, and all these things. We're all present in these characters that they created, and they couldn't have gotten that out of the book.
Right.
The
Oh, no.
only way they could have gotten that was by listening to Osage voices, tell them about our way of life, and they were able to weave that into the script, the new script that they wrote.
Sure.
And I have to say this because I think part of it's true. One is that they have, even though this global pandemic came and swept through everywhere and caused all these changes in society, and industries were shut down literally because it wasn't safe. So when Scorsese, after he talked to everybody and listened to everybody, he got up and he made some observations. And one, he said, I'm really glad I came. I learned something that I didn't know. And I promise you that I will take the time to integrate what I'm hearing tonight into the script. And he made that promise right then and there. And then he said, and I'm not going to start filming until I get the story right.
Oh, wow.
And he later said he was delaying production. It was supposed to start in March of 2020, and he was going to put it off until May of 2020. So I'm thinking, well, he's going to spend 8-9 weeks on the script. I don't know how much he's going to really change in that short of time, because so many investments have already been made based on the original script, And so I was a little concerned. But we all know what happened in spring of 2020.
Right.
The whole industry shut down for the rest of the year. And so instead of having just 8 weeks to rework the script, he had all the rest of the year to rewrite it, and he did.
Yeah.
And because of that, he changed the casting the choices.
Mm-hmm.
That's when Leo was assigned to play Ernest Burkhart, Molly's husband. And
Right.
so when I saw word of that come out of the industry trade news coverage of that big change, I was hopeful that I thought that maybe they did listen to what we said, because there's no way you're going to put an A-list actor to play the husband of an Osage woman unless you're going to spend a fair amount of time developing her character as well. And
Right.
Yeah, she's only in 3 scenes.
Yeah.
You
So
know,
that was a game changer, in my opinion, that I think. So while the world was definitely adversely impacted by the pandemic, this story, this movie, actually benefited.
right. Yeah, I think that's something we've talked about with other guests, and that, you know, the real really accurately capturing the history is possible. It just takes time.
But it takes a
like
long
it takes
time.
more effort. It takes,
Yeah.
you know, it's not the easy thing to do, but
No,
sometimes
this
it's very much
definitely
worth
not
it.
the easy thing to do.
Yeah.
And the big
Um,
studios, I mean, they want quick and then they want to make money. And so to spend all of these months getting history correct is not always the most important.
There's a scene in the movie that I wanted to ask you about, because because we typically, in what we do is cover early American history. So founding, colonial era. That's what, but maybe about 70% of the conversations that we have around that era, including some Native history sprinkled in there. The wedding scene. I was actually really interested in the clothing that was being worn
I get
there.
this question a lot.
Yeah, it's I know where some of that stuff comes from. I was shocked that they actually did it. Like I was surprised that it was included, but it was an interesting depiction. I wanted to know what you thought of sort of how that was represented.
Well, I think it goes a long way to help explain how the Osages adapted. You know, when I told you about all the removals and the treaties and all the impact that had on our Osage society, and a lot of the old ways we had to abandon, either because they weren't sufficiently passed down because the elders passed away, or, and equally, was the fact that we were going to have to learn to understand the white world as well.
Right.
And so, in what better way to demonstrate that walking in two worlds than to see that wedding coat, which was what the Osages saw the U.S. military uniforms of that era when we were making our treaties.
Right.
During that period of time. And we brought that back, that memory of it back, and Osage women tried to recreate it as something special. And instead of it being something related to the military, it was related to something that was an expression of affection. And so the way I understood the costume design choices that were made from the articles, that was kind of that was the gist of what they said, that they made that choice based on that.
Yeah, if you think about what time period, so we're in the 1920s there,
right?
These society, even before removal, it was the Osage were existing alongside of the American colonies that were just to their east, you know, and there was, it really goes to show you how like there was so much trade and exchange of ideas and fashion at some level.
Revolutionary War, you know.
Yeah, right. These were two societies that were existing next to each other
before the Louisiana Purchase. We have you know, that's why a lot of us are Catholic, because of the St. Louis mission that was established in the fort there, and a lot of Osages.
Yeah, there was a lot more of engagement between these what were literally other nations and the, you know, what they call the early American colonies and stuff, from everything that you said. And I think the perception as time has gone on, and partly because of some of the movies and popular depictions that you've told us about, is that it makes it feel like they're like Pocahontas being like a major one that like completely like othered. Like there was no cross pollination of an exchange of ideas and things going on. But even I was happy in the film to see that, like, you know, Robert De Niro could speak the language, like that character could speak the
Right.
language, and then that
Oh,
wedding scene, I was like, oh, look at that.
Yeah.
That was a big deal.
You could tell he wasn't just phoning it in. He not only got the words right, but he got the cadence, the timing, the inflection that only an Osage speaker would be able to do it. It wasn't robotic.
Wow.
It wasn't just repeating words that he was given. He understood the meanings. And one of the things that we did when I was chief 20 years ago was create a language program.
Okay.
And through the language program's efforts, we developed an orthography, an alphabet, if you will, of our sounds. And this orthography created a written Osage language that we were able to teach in public schools, create signage. Some of our publications are in English, and then it has the Osage underneath it, And if you look at the film, you'll see that at the end of the credits, at the end of the movie, before they show the credits, it'll have the Osage orthography on there. And that orthography says Killers of the Flower Moon, only it's written in Osage.
Oh, wow.
And because of that, and this is what I heard Lily Gladstone told me when we talked, that it was easy for her to understand the language because she understood the writing of the Osage.
Right.
The sounds each symbol made, and it made it easier for her to understand it. So before the lessons actually started with our language speakers teaching the actors how to speak it, she was already doing her homework and getting her mind adapted to saying the Osage words and sort of thing. So she picked it up quicker than the rest of them. But Robert DeNiro really stood out in my mind. Somebody who really, really took to it. In fact, I understand Scorsese said that he wanted more. He wanted more of the Osage language. He wasn't satisfied with what little he was able to speak. He wanted a lot more Osage in this movie. And I thought that was really interesting that they took to it that much, and we're so good at it. That was the other part. Was that you weren't just doing it, you were actually doing it really well.
Right.
And but it all goes to the con that William Hale was engaged in doing to engender himself in the Osage community. And what better way to do that than to be fluent in the language and attend the ceremonies and the family observances and show up at good times and bad times in the Osage community. And he wasn't just Henry Roan's friend; he was everybody's best friend. Everyone thought the word. It was all part of the
I'm
the least person they'll suspect that has ulterior motives because everyone likes me, and I do all this charity here and all this stuff,
I'm a good guy.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask another question about the language. So that language program, is that, you said that was put in place while you were chief?
Yeah.
Is that, as far as like developing a written system for the language, do you view that as an extension of like, hey, we need to learn how to adapt, adapting to what is basically engaged, like
but do it in our own way,
right?
And that to me is, we dress in our traditional clothing, and a lot of it's broadcloth that were imported, beads that were imported from Czechoslovakia, were sewn into the clothing for decorations and family designs. We take the Western society and then we Osage it up, and make it unique to us, And I think that was kind of the thinking that went into, that and the fact that it was just easier to teach younger kids the language if you have the symbols and you can. People like me are too old, it'll be a real chore to teach me that way. But if I was a little kid and I picked it up then, it would be a lot easier for me to learn it, And that's what we discovered when we rolled it out, is that the younger kids picked up the language better than the adults.
Oh, okay. Were you able to see any? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lynn.
No, you go ahead, Isaac. I was
going to say, were you able to see any results from that as far as people being, more people speaking, or?
Oh my God. I used to say this when I was chief, is that I feel like that younger generation, because they are, the boarding school experience and the history of the indoctrination of the children into these systems that denied of their culture and all that and their language. 100 years later, this whole generation of Osage kids that are younger ones that were in their public school age, kids were learning the language, and you could see the interactions they had with each other. And they had a swagger about it. It was like a self-confidence that wasn't that obvious before, but was really outwardly there. And I live in, I don't live in the tribal headquarters. That town is Pawhuska. I live in a town about 40 miles south of there called Skytube. And still in the res, but it's south of there and closer to Tulsa. Anyway, I heard this story, the second hand, from one of my friends whose child was going to school at Skytube High School, where we had already had the program teaching in the curriculum as a foreign elective class. Well, the quarterback for the football team was Osage.
Okay.
And he persuaded his offensive line to take the class.
Oh, wow.
And so they're all in there, and all these big, heavy-set guys of all stripes were sitting in there learning Osage. And
that's
when
brilliant.
He would play, he would yell some of the calls to start the play in Osage, and it was good for at least one offsides a game.
That's funny. That's funny.
That's pretty brilliant.
I mean, when I think about stuff like that, it makes me glad to know that just because you set up a program and you invested in hiring teachers and you developed a curriculum and you developed the orthography to go with it, doesn't mean people are going to come.
Exactly.
It was all voluntarily done. Night classes, people would come home from work and they would go and take the classes. And then now we've moved it out of the classroom and into a computer, where we have an app that you can download on your phone and learn a word every day, or you want to learn a phrase, that sort of thing. And then we have a language program on video that you can watch, So even if you're Osage and you live in California, you can still take classes. And
that's cool.
So we're exporting it in a way that keeps the culture and the language alive. And, we're taking technology and what it has to offer, and we're giving it an Osage twist to live in both worlds, so to speak, even now. That's
fascinating. And what I was thinking is that something that, when you were chief, is that sort of within the purview of what you did? And were there other programs? Like, do you do anything with clothing, with medicines, things like that?
Culturally speaking, we do a lot of videos and education videos of how to cook our traditional meals, for example.
Oh.
And the ingredients that went into it. And we have the subtitle in Osage. So
that's cool.
You get not only an education on, use a cup of flour to be, whatever, but underneath it, you'll see the Osage word for flour, in a bowl, and it'll say bowl in Osage, songs are done on video that you can listen to. We have a very, I mean, I may be a little biased because my son handles the social media responsibilities for the tribe.
Okay.
And so he's always on all the platforms promoting all these cultural things that the tribe does. And, this was all just a logical next step based on what we started, that we didn't have the money to fund all these things before until we got into gaming in a big way. So we opened 7 casinos in 5 years when I was chief.
Oh, goodness.
And we poured all that money into culture and language preservation, higher education scholarships and healthcare for all our
That's
citizens.
wonderful.
And later we would add acquiring the land that we lost to that. In the 20 years since that time, the tribe's been averaging about $10 million a year in higher ed scholarships.
Wow.
Oh, that's amazing.
That's incredible.
So when I think about this, I was like, this was about 10 years ago, I guess, when it was about 10 years. And I made this post on Facebook, on the community page that Osages go to, and I said, this didn't just, I know it started when I was chief, but every chief that followed this administration continued that same commitment to higher ed. And so we're 10 years into this level of commitment, the $10 million a year that we've been averaging. And I'm just curious if anybody would like to get on this thread and ask, A, did you receive any of the scholarship money? And B, what are you doing professionally with it? And, just tell us your experience kind of thing, right? So the responses just started coming in, because that's enough to average about $5,000 a semester for each Osage that was eligible for scholarship, which would basically put you in just about any state university or college without any, that pay for your tuition and books.
Yeah, it's a substantial chunk of it.
Yeah, and so a lot of people who may not have otherwise have gone because they're older and have family responsibilities and sort of thing, and college education was something just out of reach for them. Now they can go. Some of them may not have the means to go. Now they can. Some are going back and finishing a degree that they didn't complete. Some are doing all these different things with it. And, the stories I got back on that thread were incredible. I'm a veterinarian. I run social program at the state level. I'm working for another tribe as their casino manager. I got a business degree, and I'm started my own trucking company. And I'm, and the response overwhelmingly was that this scholarship changed my life. It gave me a chance to do something for me and my family that was just totally out of reach, and it blew me away. I just was like, wow, that was more than I expected, because there was probably 100 comments on that thread from people saying things like that. And because when you're the chief or you're working in some official capacity at the tribe and you're seeing all this money go out, you don't know the stories that are connected to those.
Right.
There's just numbers on an Excel spreadsheet,
Right.
And you can't imagine the stories of the lives you've changed by making those kind of choices. It just, so now we're talking like, we've been doing this for 20 years now. So now it's like $200 million. Wow. We probably changed it. I have no idea what the effect of that change is going to be, but I know that we have changed an entire generation of Osages with that investment.
That's incredible.
To bring this full circle, I think it's really remarkable that you posted that on Facebook and got all those positive replies and detailed answers on what people are doing with their lives, because we had actually earlier in this conversation talked about the survey that Henry Roan had filled out about that school that he was participating, where he didn't basically, he's like, I don't want to talk to you at all. Stop bothering me. That it's mirroring in a positive way that that you did something good. Yeah, it really does. It shows a lot of contrast there. And I just wanted to thank you again, because we're coming just up to our time here, but it was fascinating and wonderful to hear your perspective and talk a little about the events that are depicted in the movie and the history of the Osage tribe in general, and hearing how you are continuing despite the tragedies that have happened in the past, how have you and the other leaders of the tribe are continuing to change and basically guarantee the tribe's existence and prosperity in the future, and taking steps
Lift
towards
people
that.
up. Yeah.
Yeah.
I give a lot of credit to all the colleagues that I served with when I was chief, people on the council, the changes that we made when we moved from that old council system, getting new federal legislation passed that recognized the Osage's ability to govern themselves, exercising their inherent sovereignty, and bringing the unity back to our tribe through those changes in law, combined with the financial resources that the casinos gave us to invest in all these things, didn't end with my term.
Right.
Every chief that followed me and every Congress that followed me and the legislative body of the tribe continued to prioritize these culture, language initiatives, as well as the higher ed scholarships and the healthcare investments, to the tune of, it's almost transformational what's happened. And if I hit the spark to get all that going, I'm happy for that, having done it. But this is a testament to the Osages' belief in themselves that we could make these choices. We don't have to wait on the white man to tell us what we can and can't do. I can go back to the old ways, of who we were when we were masters of our own universe, so to speak. And so that swagger I tell you about is from that generation 20 years ago. Well, they're all coming into age now where they're taking their place in our community as leaders of their own,
And raising their children.
Exactly.
And passing along the culture.
It's a wonderful story for me to be able to tell that, because so much of that painful history that everyone knows that's in this film stops with that scene of them whitewashing the story in this 1930s radio show.
Yep.
And I'm so glad they came back and filmed that last scene of Osage's dancing with the, from the sky view, Of course, the movie ends out spoiling it for anybody who hadn't seen it, but that's how it is. But I'm glad they did not leave the Osages in the 1920s.
Right.
I think that it was important that Scorsese add that scene to show that, okay, so you didn't know the story. Now you know why you didn't know it.
Yep.
Because they rewrote it and they whitewashed it. And just to add an exclamation point, and by the way, the Osages are still here.
And thriving.
Yeah. And in a way that, I'm not sure Henry Roan would even be able to imagine a future the way it turned out.
That's a wonderful thought.
Yeah. So I'm kind of really, I feel like it was an obligation on my part to make myself available for programs like this. Not just to talk about the tragedy, but the triumph of what happened years later, of how much the Osage changed. And we may have been victims back then, but we don't live like victims, And I think that's an important message that I hope your listeners take away from this podcast.
Absolutely. I think that the biggest thing that I'm hoping that this will spur some curiosity in folks to go look into the history of not just, like you said, not just the tragedy, but the entire history of both the Osage tribe and other tribes. They're still around. The people that we're talking about. There's 570 tribes. Yeah, they got a long history. A lot of them are doing really interesting things.
And be discerning about the history you read and where it's coming from.
Exactly. Especially if it's from the 1930s. So thank you so much, Jim. I mean, I can't thank you enough for sharing your perspective, and hope
it's really been an honor having you on, and just can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you for your interest, and just somebody email me a link when it's up. I'd like to know when.
Oh, absolutely,
friends. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, we would like to have, if you can send us links for anything for the Osage Nation. If you have, can we find you anywhere on Twitter or anywhere who's interesting? Who wants to learn more about you?
Jim Gray.
Jim Gray tweets with a Z.
Tweets with a Z. All right.
Perfect.
There you
Yeah.
go. And not to plug your son's work, but go follow the official social media accounts of the Osage Nation.
Absolutely.
Go check it out.
We can put those links in as well.
Yeah, we'll drop those links in the description.
If you just Google Osage Nation, all those things will pop up, I believe. So they should be relatively easy to find and share. And
that's great.
Learn more about the tribe and what we're doing.
Fantastic.
And the last question I had for you before we wrap up totally is, besides the book, the Killers of the Flower Moon, that the movie is based on, are there any other books that we could recommend to our readers that are about the Osage, or maybe by Osage writers that might be worthwhile?
In particular, that I think I would recommend. One is a story of the Osage Reign of Terror from an Osage point of view, in a fictional story that was based on the tragedies of many Osages whose crimes were not investigated by the FBI. And it's told in a format that's fiction, so the names are changed, but the stories are true.
Right.
The title of the book is called A Pipe for February, which came out in 2003, I think.
Okay.
And the author's name is Charles Redcorn. He passed away a few years ago, but as irony would have it, his son, Yancey Redcorn, plays Chief Bodicastle in this film.
Oh, really?
Wow.
So
yeah.
Oh.
And the opening scene actually is from A Pipe for February, where they actually bury the pipe, at the beginning.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
That is not in Killers of the Flower Moon, the book. It is in A Pipe for February.
All right. That sounds like something worth reading.
So that's a good book to read, because you read both of them, you get a really interesting point of view of both the investigators and the criminals, as well as the Osage. And I would recommend you read them both together. Another one is called The Deaths, with an S, of Sybil Bolton. It was written by an Osage writer. His name is Dennis McCullough. And he was working at the Washington Post as a editor at the time. And his mom thought she was going to pass away, and she never told him that he was Osage. And
you're kidding. She
thought that she was going to die, and so she told him this horrible family secret that you're going to inherit an interest in the oil field because you're an Osage Indian.
Wow. And
she never raised him that way. And so he was blown away. And as oddly as luck would have it, she didn't die. She was just really sick, but she unloaded all this, what she thought was embarrassing information, turned out to be the basis of a piece of real serious investigative journalism into how his grandmother was killed.
Oh, wow.
My goodness.
And it was no different than all the others that we've been talking about. The Guardian that took care of her, when she hit 21, because she was less than half, she was going to get her competency. And unfortunately, the Guardian had other plans, and he had her murdered.
Oh, my gosh.
Goodness.
But she had already had her mother, and so he was able to keep the guardianship going by being the guardian of the baby.
Huh.
And so, that's another good one. Those two books, Killers of the Flower Moon, would make a good trilogy for anybody who wants to learn more.
All right, for anyone listening,
we'll put links to those.
Yeah, we'll put links in the description to all those books.
Easy links,
all Amazon, by the way. I think you can find them all there.
Perfect.
Great. All right, well, Jim, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time and your thoughts and insight.
Thank you guys for having me.